Hey, welcome back. And as always, I'm so glad that you are here. I want to start today with something that happened in a leadership conversation that I had not too long ago with a pastor who had asked his team for some feedback on a very specific directional decision. Okay, which is a good idea, by the way. Getting feedback from your team on a directional decision is a great idea, right? People need to weigh in if we want them to eventually buy in. So good idea. And I think you should consider doing that if you're not doing it. But in this situation, here's what happened afterwards. The team who he asked gave input. A couple of people pushed back fairly hard. And this pastor, who knew in his gut where he needed to go, started adjusting. And it wasn't because the pushback really changed his thinking, but because the people who gave it were watching and he didn't know what to do with that pressure. Listen, that dynamic is more common than I think most pastors are willing to admit. And today, I want to kind of name that pressure clearly. I want to give you something that you can do if you are ever in the middle of it. Okay, here's kind of the core tension of this conversation. Somewhere, right, in the culture of leadership, we have confused soliciting feedback with agreeing to comply with the feedback. Let me say that again, okay? Somewhere along the way in this leadership culture that we are in, that you have developed, that you have experienced, whatever, however you want to define that, somewhere along the way, we all are guilty of this. We at times get confused between the difference, right, between soliciting feedback and agreeing to comply with the feedback. And that confusion can create a real cost. When you invite input, right, people will give it. Sometimes they give it without it being invited, right? But unsolicited feedback, that's always fun. But when you solicit feedback, people are going to give it to you. And you know this, then they watch. They watch to see what you're going to do with it. Like they want to see evidence that their feedback mattered. Like they want to see evidence that they were heard. And if you're wired towards kind of relational health, listen, if keeping people engaged and bought in is something that you genuinely care about, which hopefully we all do care about that on some level, right? You feel the weight of all of those expectations. So even when nobody says it out loud, right, you feel that. So here's what I want you to hear clearly, kind of early in this conversation, right? Soliciting input is not outsourcing your judgment. This is a big piece of this conversation. Asking for feedback, asking for input is not the same thing as outsourcing your judgment to the person giving you the feedback. Those are two completely different things. You can genuinely want to know what someone thinks and still arrive at a completely different decision. That is not a contradiction. You know what that's actually is called? It's called leadership. But if you don't have a clear posture towards the feedback before it arrives, the social pressure can just fill the gap for you. And what you end up doing accidentally is complying instead of deciding. You comply with the person giving you the feedback instead of deciding based on maybe what they gave you and based on what you know too. So let's kind of name, if I can, I think there are two kind of failure modes that show up here, and I have seen both of them lots of times. And if I'm honest, I have probably lived them out as well, both of these things. And they're both problematic because they damage the team, they can damage you as a leader. There's a lot of kind of shrapnel that can come from these two things. So here's the first one. The first one is just rejection, right? This is the leader who doesn't actually want the feedback. Like they really want affirmation, right? Questions get deflected, new ideas kind of can get minimized. People in the room can kind of feel it. And after a while, they stop engaging, right? Because they know it isn't going anywhere. They stop bringing their best thinking because they have figured out, they have learned that it actually doesn't matter to you, right? So our first response can be, right, one of these kind of death spiral responses, a failure mode, is rejection when people give us feedback. The second one, though, is capitulation. This is the leader who treats every piece of input like a directive. Now, you would never say you do that out loud, but just think about this, right? These are the leaders who kind of shift direction based on the volume of the feedback or the volume of the individual giving it. They adjust behavior on who spoke last, or as I said, who spoke loudest. The team figures this out fast. I have worked with some leaders like this before. And here's the coincidence, right? They learn that the way to move the leader is just to be persistent, not right. You just have to be the loudest and the last to give your feedback, and you typically get what you want. Like, you may have accidentally taught your team that the pathway to influence is timely pressure. And you don't need me to tell you this, none of those outcomes is good for you or the organization, the staff, the church that you're leading. The good news is that both of those outcomes are avoidable. And the posture that I kind of want to give you today is actually very simple. Before you get feedback, so you can solicit it, right? You can ask people for feedback, but before that feedback is given to you, before it arrives, I want you to do four things. Just four things, very simple. I want you to pre-decide on four things. One, I want to hear the feedback. Two, I'll sit with the feedback. Three, I will weigh the feedback against what I know. And then four, I'll decide. Okay, let me say that one more time. This is like a process map for decision making when feedback is involved, right? First, I'm going to listen to the feedback. Now, we listen with our ears, not our mouth. Remember this as a child, right? God gave you one mouth and two ears for a reason, right? That's my mom and dad would tell me. So probably because I talk too much. But when it comes to feedback, when you ask for it, this isn't a debate conversation. This isn't a pushback thing. You just listen. You listen. And then the second thing you do after you receive the feedback is not react, you process. You sit with that feedback. Then you weigh it against everything that you know and, by the way, all the other feedback that you're getting. Hopefully you're getting more than just one person's feedback. So you weigh all of that information, including the information you have that you already know. And then the fourth thing, last thing, then you decide. Listen, that probably sounds too simple, but it is. It's so effective. That's the posture that you have to take as a leader. And I know that isn't complicated, but it does require that you kind of actually own that leadership role. Listen, you were called to lead. That's why you're in this role. You were called to lead, not to aggregate opinions and implement a consensus. That is not your job. When input arrives, think of it as data. When input arrives, you are gathering data, and you are responsible for what the data means and what happens next, not them. It's your responsibility. So here's the thing that I think surprises a lot of pastors and leaders when they start kind of actually leading this way. The team actually gets more confident in you, not less. When people can see that you think through this, that you are weighing all the information, and that you are deciding with intention, that's actually what they want. Even, this is important, even when they disagree with the decision, they want to know that you are listening to them, to others, to God, to your intuition, and you are processing to make clear decisions. So again, the posture is very simple. So let's just get super practical for a minute, because I think the hardest part of this is not actually the internal decision. I think the hardest part is the external conversations you have to have, especially after the decision. Like, what do you say to the person whose feedback you heard is not where you're going to go? So let me just give you a few options on how to handle that, okay? Again, the person who gives you feedback and you end up agreeing and moving in that direction, it's a pretty easy conversation. But when a person gives you feedback and they don't feel that you're heading in the direction that they think you should because of what they told you, how do you handle that? And I'll tell you one thing you don't do is ignore it or pretend they didn't give it. You need to talk with them about it. So here's some few things you can do. The first one is just be real direct about it, right? You can say something like, I really appreciate you bringing that to me. I have been sitting with that information for a while, I've been processing it, and here's where I have landed, right? And then just tell them your decision. Like, and don't even over-explain it. You don't owe anyone a lengthy defense of your judgment. You're the leader for a reason. But you do owe them, I think, maybe the dignity, the respect to at least explain or inform them that they were heard, that you processed, but ultimately this is what you think is best. And a sentence or two of that can go a long, long, long way. Here's another thing that you could say, right? So maybe something like, when someone gives you feedback that is different, you can say, that's a perspective that I hadn't fully considered. Thank you for telling me that. It doesn't change my decision or direction though, but it is sharpening how I think about it. That's really honest. And feedback doesn't always change a decision, right? But it could inform it a little bit more. It could help with a future decision. And there's a real difference there, right? And naming that for that person, it really respects the person who gave it to you. Let me give you one more. Maybe you would just say, hey, and this is somebody who's maybe a little bit more belligerent about it, right? But maybe you would just say, hey, I want you to know that I hear you. And this is one of those situations where I have to make a judgment call with more information than I can share fully. And I hope that you can trust me to make that decision. Now, that would take some confidence, right? But it is so appropriate when the decision involves like a context the person doesn't have access to and can't have access to. Like, for instance, I've had to do this several times when we've had to let people go, let staff members go. And you need to inform maybe their team, maybe they were a ministry director, and you had to inform the other staff or volunteers that reported to them, and eventually the whole staff. You need to have a conversation about it. And a lot of people aren't going to agree with you. And you can't unpack all the dirty laundry. No one should know all the details because that's unfair to that person. And by the way, if they were the person, they wouldn't want you sharing all the details either, right? So you can't give them the full context. What you can do is ask them to trust you and ask them to lean into that and know that they were heard, but at the same time, you have to make a decision. And that isn't dismissive, right? It's just honest about kind of where the conversation is and where it can't be. Like with all three of those kind of options, and there's dozens more, right? They all do have something in common, and maybe you saw this. They don't pretend, they don't over-explain, and you know what? They don't apologize for leading, not apologizing for deciding. And that's kind of what I want you to make sure you avoid, right? Do not imply that you are going to act on someone's feedback if you aren't. Never do that, right? And don't give vague responses, like, oh, that's really good, I'll think about it, or we'll see, and then you never follow back up. Oftentimes I hear leaders do things like that because, well, maybe they're just insecure or they're just so, and I understand this, but just so people-pleasing oriented that they don't want to say the hard thing. But that is so painful for other people on the other side of the decision, right? Because when you say those things to people and then you end up going in a different direction, where does that place them? What does it do to them? I'll tell you what, one thing it does, it destroys their trust between you and them, right? They walk away feeling misled. I mean, clarity is always kinder than ambiguity. Even if you're uncertain, right? Even when you're uncertain, you can't afford to be unclear, especially if you're going to head in a different direction than the one they think you should go in. So let me just quickly close with kind of the stakes of this conversation, right? Because this is challenging, but it isn't just about managing individual conversations. A leader who can't close the feedback loop, and that's what this is, it's a feedback loop. A leader who can't effectively close a feedback loop really creates a very specific kind of confusion in the team. People stop knowing what the point of speaking up is. They give input, they watch what happens, and then if the outcome feels disconnected from the conversations they've had, then they don't just lose confidence in the process. This is terrible. They lose confidence in you as the leader. But when you learn to hear input without losing your judgment, and when you communicate your decisions clearly and directly, you protect something that is way more valuable than any single outcome. You actually protect your team's belief that speaking up is worth the risk. And you know what? They don't need you to do what they say. They need to know that when they speak, it reaches you. And that when you decide, you actually decided. Not reacted, not caved, not deferred, but you decided. So before your next team conversation, I'd just love for you to do this. Decide your posture before they even open their mouths, right? Decide that you are going to listen. You're going to weigh everything you hear. You're going to tell them where you've landed. You're going to do it clearly, directly, without apologizing. Right? That's not a minor communication adjustment for a lot of us, right? That is a leadership shift. And it starts with you deciding before the feedback begins. All right, that's all I got for you today, but that is a lot. Thanks for listening, and I hope it adds a little more intention to your mission.